Hello YouTube! First thing first, long time no see. I've had some things going on in my life that prevented me from making videos, but I'm now back and operational. So if you have been waiting all this time, thank you for your patience. What I want to do today is, I want to go against the grain a bit and do something I usually don't do on this channel, which is take a look at a study that recently came out, one that was published by Jeff Nippard. Now, oftentimes I am anti-science on this channel, not because I don't believe in science, but because I think that the majority of influencers that call themselves science-based are just running a gimmick and they don't actually care about the studies they present. But in this case, it's different because this paper covers a ton of topics that are extremely relevant to muscle building. I thought it would be a great idea if I presented it to you guys. And the goal of the paper was actually to pinpoint the optimal training technique for bodybuilding. So what training method is going to net you the highest amount of muscle? I'm certain that this is fascinating for everyone. And since I can vouch for the paper actually being legitimate and being quite interesting, I think you're going to want to listen to this. So here's what we're going to do today. First, I'm going to review the study and I'm going to share the findings with you, what you can learn from it. Then I'll be adding some nuance to the findings and I'll also discuss some of the flaws and critiques that I have for the paper. And then we'll finish the video with a broader discussion around optimal training because that is quite literally the name of the paper. Now, when it comes to figuring out what optimal training technique is, this study focuses on three main factors: range of motion, tempo, and technique, which are the cornerstones of any movements that you may be doing in the gym. And I want to start by looking at range of motion because it's the least surprising aspect of the study in my opinion. So essentially, what the study uncovered is that it seems that performing exercises with greater range of motion, so what we would call full range of motion, tends to lead to greater hypertrophy. I don't think that anyone is surprised by this. We have known that for a very long time. However, while the paper brings us something new is that by gathering and comparing a ton of studies that relate to range of motion, Jeff managed to unveil a very interesting fact, and that is that a partial range of motion might actually be more optimal for hypertrophy than a full range of motion. And that is quite surprising, although it is something that is coming out more and more nowadays with the concept of the lengthened partial. So the idea is that if you cut the range of motion and you only keep the end of it while the muscle is lengthened, this seems to produce greater muscle growth in comparison with a range of motion where you go all the way down and all the way up, while the muscle lengthens all the way and shortens all the way. And that might be best explained by the fact that since you're not doing the full movement, you can use more weight and you can also get more reps. So now you're targeting the part of the range of motion while the muscle responds more optimally to the hypertrophic stimulus. And on top of that, you get more of it, which is in contradiction to a different type of partial, that is the shortened partial, where you are performing only the part of the movement where the muscle contracts. So this would be, for example, the top of a squat or the top of a curl, in which case you would also be able to use more weight and get more reps. But the study shows that even if you were to do that, you would get less results than a lengthened partial and then a full range of motion. So in terms of hierarchy of hypertrophy, it goes lengthened partial, normal range of motion, and then shortened partial. However, we also see in the study that this seems to only be true for certain muscle groups. So we have data for the hamstrings, we have data for the biceps and for the triceps, which I think is interesting because it shows that you don't need to lock out the elbow joint to get the maximum benefits from your tricep isolation. If anything, it might be detrimental. The most important part of the range of motion is the one where the tricep is lengthened optimally. This is not a surprise to me. It might not be a surprise to you. This is something that I've been doing for a very long time. I personally don't lock out my elbows. Another interesting part of the finding is also that the contraction that many people like to tout as super important for growth doesn't seem to be that important at all, because when we remove that portion of the lift, the hypertrophic response doesn't seem to diminish. So it might very well be that this flex and this squeeze of the muscle at the top is more of a placebo effect or more of a sensation tool that feels good but might not actually be that important. You might still be doing it if you want to. In the case of full range of motion, that is going to be part for the course, but insisting on the contraction is apparently detrimental as opposed to insisting on the lengthening and the stretching of the muscle. But as I said, this is only for these muscle groups I just cited. For something like the traps, we don't have the data. So it'll be interesting to see when that comes out. But I think that for the traps, we'll actually find the exact same thing. And if anything, it might be even more extreme. I believe that for the traps, we might eventually find out that no range of motion might be superior. Just letting the traps stretch as you just hold onto heavy weight might actually produce optimal hypertrophy. That again is up for discovery. Now, in terms of practical application to that to your training, what does it mean? Well, this means that as a bodybuilder, you should always try to prioritize range of motion, so a full range of motion, and the part of the range of motion you must insist on is the portion where the muscle is lengthened, so the bottom of the negative. Again, not anything revolutionary in my opinion. I didn't learn anything new, but it's nice to be comforted in the idea that this is the part of the lift that matters the most. And importantly enough, the study has compared people who used different loads. So someone who went full range of motion with a focus on the lengthened partial and used less weight saw better results than someone who used more weight with less range of motion. That is super key because there are still people who are stuck in this mindset of lift heavy weights to get bigger. That is true if and only if the range of motion is appropriate. So before you try to start to lift as heavy as possible and load the bar, you should first settle on an appropriate range of motion. And once you standardize that range of motion, so it's always the same rep after rep, then you can load, because at this point, you will be loading effectively. You will get the maximum from the weight. And this is key because naturally, as a man, as a lifter, you get into the gym, you want to progress, and your instincts tell you to lift heavier, and sometimes this can result in detrimental range of motion because before realizing it, you start to cut it short. And as you cut it short, of course, you progress, not because you're getting stronger or bigger, but because you're artificially modifying the leverage of the lift by making it easier because you cut down the range of motion. So it's super important that you always stick to that full roam that you have decided will be the standard going forward for that specific lift. Of course, this varies from lift to lift, and you also have to take into account whether or not range of motion feels comfortable. Don't force yourself into ranges of motion that you might not have the mobility for, you might not have the leverage for, depending on your height, etc., etc. But again, as I said, nothing mind-blowing so far. The real interesting part of the study comes next. So after range of motion, the study also looked at tempo, which tends to be under-discussed and underrated, in my opinion, when it comes to hypertrophy. And what the studies found, because it's a comparison across the board, seems to be that regardless of the tempo, as long as you are between 2 seconds and 8 seconds, you're good. Meaning that there seems to be no difference in hypertrophy between a 2-second tempo, so 1 second positive, 1 second negative, and an 8-second tempo. So let's say, for example, a 6-second negative and a 2-second positive. And that is crazy, right? Because you would think that the time you spend lifting the weight and the speed at which you lift the weight would have a bigger impact than that. Now, naturally, when I heard this, my first instinct was to think, okay, if the study didn't actually standardize the load, then it's bogus because it's perfectly logical that if you take two individuals and they both lift 50 pounds, the one that lifts 50 pounds slower is going to gain more muscle. The question is, would you gain more muscle if the guy who lifts faster than you also lifts more weight, right? That is the question. And because I couldn't really find the information in the study, I reached out to a person that participated, that person being Milo Wolf. And I asked him, hey, do you know if they modified the load based on the tempo? And he confirmed that apparently that is standard practice, that is standard methodology. They actually thought about it beforehand, which thank God they did, because if they didn't, the study would be for nothing. So that's crazy. This means that you could potentially reduce the load that you lift by 30%, and as long as you heightened the tempo and you lift slower, the results that you'll gain in terms of hypertrophy, not strength, seem to be the same. And where it gets even more surprising is that apparently they tried multiple valuable combos of tempo and they all gave the same results. So they tried 3-second positive, 3-second negative, 2-second positive, 1-second negative. And as long as you're within that ballpark of 2 seconds to 8 seconds, all the results seem to be the same. So in a nutshell, as long as you are controlling the eccentric for at least 1 second, and you're not just letting gravity do the work for you, you're good. You are within what we can consider to be optimal territory for hypertrophy, which is a good news because this means that you can now let tempo be dictated by preference and not stress out too much by telling yourself, oh, I have to count in my head 1, 2, 3, or else it's all for nothing. No, you're good. Now, I would actually encourage you to go check out the study for yourself because it's actually very short and very easy to understand. One thing that is a bit confusing is that some studies even go as far as to say that a person lifting less weight for more time experiences greater hypertrophy than someone lifting more weight for less time. I'm not super convinced about that. I think we need more information. But essentially, if this comes out to be true, it means that the bros were right all along and that time under tension seems to be much more important than the weight that you lift. So as we've heard a million times before, it's not about how much weight is on the bar, it's about how the weight feels as you lift it. But I think that we need to be a bit careful with this finding because I don't want this to become the reason why you go out and start just slashing your loads and you start using baby weights with 6-second negatives. Because even though the study shows that apparently there's nothing wrong with that in terms of growth, there are a ton of additional factors that might make it so that this method will still down the line be subpar for hypertrophy. So for example, the longer your negative is, the harder it becomes to standardize because now you have to keep track of each negative and you have to make sure that they're all the same for every single rep. And if there's something that we know and that the study shows as well is that standardizing the range of motion and the tempo is super important. It is actually even more important than the tempo or range of motion itself because if it's too fluctuant, if it changes too much, it's going to sabotage your ability to progressively overload. And since we know that any variation of tempo speed is going to greatly impact how much weight you can use, so there might be a differential of 20 pounds between a 2-second negative and a 6-second negative, you absolutely have to make sure that the tempo stays the same for every single rep. And that's not an easy task. Keeping track of tempo in between sets, different sets, is already hard enough, but within the same set itself, in between reps, once you start getting tired, you're going to have a tendency to start to speed up the tempo because you want to get done with the set, you want to get momentum so that you can get the weight up, all of which is going to compound and make keeping that long negative super, super difficult, which in result might encourage you to use weights that are not that challenging, which ultimately could be bad for hypertrophy. Because we also know that this time is going to compound. So if you have a 6-second eccentric and you do sets of 15, that's 6 times 15. First off, that's a lot of time to spend during a set, so it might actually be boring, it might kill your focus because you're going to start to think about something else, because it's not going to keep you engaged, right? We like to lift heavy weight because it's fun, but also because it forces your brain and your central nervous system to stay focused. I know for a fact that for me, if I use that technique with lightweight, I think that like midway through the set, I would start thinking about my dinner, about what's on TV. This is not conducive to actually being very intense in the gym, and intensity is super important. Then there's also the question of fatigue. these very slow negatives, yes, might give you the same result, but how much fatigue are you going to accumulate doing that? It's going to be super, super tough to track because each rep is so long. So if that method eventually ends up turning lifting to a chore and something that is not fun anymore, then it becomes detrimental because, as we all know, adherence is the most important factor. And as such, I think that if you want to keep lifting heavy loads, there is a perfectly good middle ground here because the study also shows that a 1 second negative also seems to get similar results for hypertrophy. So if you're the type who likes to throw weight around, which is my case as well, it's fun, then stick to that controlled negative and you're going to be all good. But to be fair, I also want to discuss the advantages that might come with a very slow tempo. And I actually see two. The first one would be a better mind-muscle connection because you're going to spend more time throughout the movement. It's going to be easier to feel the stretch and the contraction. So this might actually be good for people who struggle to create that connection with their lats, for example, or their chest. You might want to spend a period of time with lighter weights and slower tempo, and then once that connection is built, you can go back up to heavier weights. And the second one is the injury risk. As we know, injury is something that you want to avoid as a lifter, and there's no study about that, it's just me spitballing, but I think I'm on the money here. A slower tempo is going to greatly reduce the risk of injury. And I think it also explains why pro bodybuilders love a super slow tempo, and also why I've seen a ton of people who, when they diet and when they become weaker, also like to lighten the load, but as they lighten the load, they up the tempo. And that way, they get the best of both worlds. There's less injury risk, but they still get the same tension on the muscle, which is great news because even if you're not a pro bodybuilder or you're not super lean yourself, like myself, I'm not lean at all, you are going to be able to make use of that if you ever get injured. We've all been injured, it's a bitch because you can't lift as heavy. Well, this study shows that actually you could still be doing the movement pattern with less weight and a slower tempo, get no pain, don't risk any reoccurring injury, and your muscle gains might be similar. This is mind-blowing. So for all of my bros out there who are afraid of shrinking back to the size of a shrimp because they got hurt, no worries, apparently you are covered by this technique. But talking about technique, that is the big question mark that this study leaves relatively untouched because I don't think they had enough time to cover that topic because it's so broad. But if we look at the trinity or the four factors that are the most important, when it comes to actually building muscle, we might have load, range of motion, tempo, and then you have technique. Technique is the way you actually approach the pattern, the way the body moves through space. And so I would even argue that in terms of hypertrophy, technique might actually be the most important factor, even more important than range of motion. And if you want a quick hierarchy, I guess, I would say that you have technique number 1, then range of motion number 2, tempo number 3, and then you have time under tension that ranks up as number 4 because it's just a byproduct of tempo. And then you have the overarching concept of load that I can't really rank. I would rank it as 0 because it is technically the most important of all, regardless of the range of motion, regardless of the tempo. If the weight that you use is not challenging enough, you will not grow. So it's an underlying condition. It makes or breaks everything else because it's volume and intensity, right? We know that when it comes to building muscle, volume and intensity are the primary drivers of muscle growth. So this is what I would rank at the top of the top. But the study, while it never looks at load because we already know about load, also never relooks at technique. Now, Jeff apparently says that he will come up with a follow-up study about technique. For the reason that I said is because there are so many parameters to cover. So things that technique will cover are, for example, feet width, like how far apart are your feet on the squat and how much does this improve or reduces the recruitment of the quads, of the glutes, of the hamstrings. Degree of elbow tuck on presses. How much does it improve recruitment of the shoulders or the triceps? I've heard some people say that if you press with your elbows tucked, your shoulders are never going to grow. We don't have actually data on this because shockingly enough, and I've seen that in a study and that blew my mind, there's only one study about lifting technique, only one, and the study is extremely lackluster. So we do actually need more data. Then there is degree of shoulder extension on tricep isolation. As you know, it plays a big role in recruiting the long head. And in the same vein, you also have the upward mobility of the elbow joint during curls. How much does it help recruit the bicep? Some people say that if you curl and you go all the way up like this, you recruit more bicep. Some people, like me, say that it's bogus. You can lift more weight because you use the shoulder joint and the musculature of the shoulder, but you get less biceps because you are quote-unquote cheating, and a strict curl is done with your elbows stationary. I don't have data to prove that, it's just my personal experience. So these are a lot of questions that the study about technique is going to answer, but I think that the most important question that it's going to actually tackle is whether or not cheat reps are good for hypertrophy. That is the million-dollar question. Lots of people who do cheat reps will swear to you that they're even better than clean reps, or that people who don't do cheat reps are pussies. People who don't like cheat reps, such as myself, will tell you that cheat reps are ego lifting, and they don't do that much because you're cheating, you're using body English, so the muscle that you're trying to target is not actually being recruited as much as you think. And I think that's sound. I think that if you look logically at the way the body moves, if you recruit additional muscles, even if you add more weight onto the bar, you have no idea to know how much these muscles actually play a role. And the same goes for body English. Body English is even worse. When you use body English, it's not even the muscle that's getting the weight up, it's gravity, it's the momentum that you built up by moving the weight. So I'm actually very interested in this upcoming study. So if you guys are interested, let me know in the comments. I will be making a similar video, a follow-up, in order to streamline the findings and to discuss all of it and to add nuance, because I think that this is the type of discussion that we need more of. And talking about discussions that are important to have, it is now time to move on with the second part of this discussion video, where I actually tackle the concept of optimal training. Because even though I just discussed the findings of a study that attempts to find out what optimal training technique is, and I agree and appreciate the findings, I still think that there are many problems with it. And the first problem is the nature of the study itself, because when you look at the title, you think, okay, this is going to tell me what optimal training technique is. But if you go and you actually read the paper, you will find at the end that this is not the case at all. What the paper and what fitness studies in general are very good at doing is that they are excellent at telling you what not to do, because they're very good at pinpointing and highlighting the methods that definitely do not work for hypertrophy. So, based on the findings of the paper, we know that shortened partials and cutting range of motion all the time is not good for hypertrophy. We know also that not controlling your negative is not good for hypertrophy. So if you're the type of person who, when they do lat pull down or pull-ups, you just let the weight or the stack go all the way up and you don't control it, you just let yourself fall from the pull-up bar, you are shooting yourself in the foot. We know that 100%. But that's pretty much that. The paper at no point is telling you that there's one training technique that you must follow and that's it, and everything else is bogus. And to be clear, I don't ask the paper to do that because I know for a fact that it's not possible. An absolutely objective truth regarding optimal training doesn't actually exist. And this is why I think that Jeff's paper does a great job at showing that most answers in the realm of fitness are always going to be relatively open-ended. And this is very important to remember, because there is this idea or notion that one person should hold the truth and that this truth will be unchanging and it will be unnegotiable, and that is simply not the case. And I think it's important that you remember that, because if you pay attention to YouTube Fitness, you'll notice that every single influencer claims that their advice and their method is optimal for muscle building, whether they have studies to back it up or not. And that is not surprising. It's, if you're familiar with it, a form of prisoner dilemma. It's essentially a choice where you have a group of individuals, and if all of the individuals agree to play the game by the same rules, they all get a benefit, a small one. But if one member of the group decides to go rogue and fuck the rest of the members, that person will go free, and everyone else in the group, all of the other prisoners, are going to see their jail time increase greatly. So, because human nature is what it is, what you tend to see with that type of dilemma is that everyone in the group tries to fuck the other people over because they try to protect themselves. It's the same with optimal training. If you have a group of influencers and out of the group you have only one guy who claims to be optimal and no one else does, this guy gains great benefit because he gains great influence and great visibility. So naturally the other members of the group all start to claim that their training method is optimal as well because they don't want to lose out. But what ends up happening is that you then have a very confusing situation for the audience because you have 15 different people with 15 different training methods who all tell you that their method is the best. And this is something that I hear beginners complain about a ton, where they say, well, I don't understand what I'm supposed to do. Who am I supposed to listen to? Well, I don't really have an answer for you because I'm also in the dilemma. I'm also playing that game. If I give you advice, it's because I believe my advice is good. So it is really up to you to not fall for what is essentially a marketing strategy. And I think that it is very important that we keep that in mind, because if we regard that appellation as a marketing strategy, we can remove it from the domain of objectivity and then we can criticize it. Because you have to realize, I hope, that the people who claim to be optimal do so with that in mind. They do so because that way they claim the high ground. And once they have that high ground, they no longer have to defend their practices, because if you go against them or if you criticize them, then suddenly you are anti-optimal training and so you are wrong by default. You see the same strategy with people who claim to be backed by science, because that way, if you attack them, you attack science, so you're anti-science, and so you are wrong, which, by the way, is entirely anti-scientific. And I'm not saying by that that Jeff is doing that, not at all. Actually, his paper, as I said, by being open-ended, does the exact opposite. It's anti-dogmatism. But not everyone is as honest as he is on this platform, sadly. And if you've paid attention, you might have noticed that this type of manipulation is not limited to fitness. It's actually widespread. And it's what I call ontological manipulation. So it's when you claim a certain name because that name makes you right by default. And I have two great examples to share with you, two that are very extreme and on both sides of the political spectrum, so that you get what I'm talking about. So the first one is Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is a name that was selected because it is supposedly working towards making people realize that black lives are in danger, black people are being attacked, etc., etc. I'm not arguing against that. What I'm saying is that by picking this name, you already position yourself as morally right, because if anyone disagrees with the message of Black Lives Matter, then by default, they are anti-black lives, so they want black people to die, and so they are monsters, you win the argument. Likewise with people who call themselves pro-life. If you're pro-life, this means that people who are against you are anti-life, so they are murderers, they are bad people, you win the argument by default. I'm not here to tell you that either of these movements are right or that one is good or one is evil. I don't care. I use them because they're perfect examples of ontological manipulation. And the issue with this strategy is that it entirely kills any discussion. And in the realm of fitness and in life in general, discussion is all we have. We have to be able to argue our points, to defend our opinions, so that we can come to a conclusion, we can come to an agreement, and we can advance as people. We can become more intelligent and more adept. So paradoxically, the advent of optimal training is detrimental to the scientific or even experience-based approach to fitness and our ability to refine the practice, because the entire thing just kills any possibility we have of actually looking objectively at the data. And I think that reframing the problem that way is also a good opportunity to not fall for basic anti-scientific messaging. I know that many people now are falling into the camp of the meathead versus the scientist, which leads to a ton of people becoming super dogmatic one way or the other. The guy who only swears by studies and the guy who tells you that studies and science in general is complete bullshit and all that matters is just to do. And the problem is that both camps are unbalanced in my opinion because they're missing the point entirely. But since I'm more in the camps of the meatheads, I want to make sure that you guys don't become like this. Do not become the type of person who refuses to think about the parameters of his training because that's for nerds. That's completely idiotic. More often, when you look at a natural lifter who has a great physique, you're looking at a nerd. You're looking at someone who is obsessed about their training and who is constantly trying to refine their approach. As I like to say, you don't stumble upon a great body. This is something that takes years. So if you're going to be in the gym for years, might as well think about what you're doing. I have found with time that most often when people complain about plateaus or about a natural limit, the limitation is never physical. It's never really that their body is not able to grow anymore. It's that the brain that is attached to the body is no longer able to figure out a way to keep growing. So instead of calling it a natural limit, we should call it an intellectual limit, because that's what it is. And it's not even a question of stupidity. I don't think these people are stupid. I think that they made themselves stupid because they have bought into the idea that not thinking made them superior. So they romanticize being a meathead to the point that now their dream of becoming jacked is completely out of reach. And I'm not saying by this that you have to follow exactly what this person says or what this study says, not at all. I'm just telling you that you have to copy their mindset, the mindset of a student. You want to be big, you want to be jacked, you have to become a student of the game. Because I can tell you for a fact that I've met many of the just lift, eat and sleep bro type, the ones that tell you that you must not overcomplicate things and that lifting is actually super simple. If it was that simple, why would people for the past 15 years make videos about lifting, and why do we keep making videos? Why do we keep trying to run studies to find out new things? It's because lifting, the game of lifting, is infinite. We're not done. Of course, we figure out most of the important things, but there are still things to refine, and it is through this refinement of the practice that we keep pushing the natural limit. That being said, this doesn't mean that you have to rely on science. Right? If you follow this channel, you know that I'm personally purely experience-based. I never reread studies. I've never really modified my training based on studies, simply because it's not my thing. And that has never prevented me from growing, because after all, studies are just mass anecdotal evidence. Yeah, they're going to give you great guidelines and they give you a lot of information in relation to what will work and what will most likely not work, but this is something that you could figure out for yourself. It's just going to take more time. And this is a point I think is important to make, because many people reject science because they don't like to be told what to do. They have their own method that they enjoy and they don't want to change from it. And I get it, I'm the exact same way, but don't be the type of idiot or cretin that gets upset because there's evidence that comes out that your methods might not actually be the best. Who cares if they're not the best? If you've seen results from them and they align with your adherence and are fun for you, keep doing that. So for example, for me, even though this study came out and clearly shows that partial range of motion might not be the best, I'm still going to do partial preacher curls. Why? Because I enjoy them. Because they feel good on my tendons, because I'm able to progress, and because I'm seeing growth. In the same vein, I'm still going to train my legs with only free weights, even though the study shows that you might actually want to isolate certain muscles of the legs, like the rectus femoris, that better arm strengths are usually created by leg curls plus hip hinges. All of that I agree with, but I don't like to train this way, so I'm going to keep lifting heavy weights on hip hinges, on all of these squat variations that I love, and that's that. And maybe one day I'll change my mind. Likewise with the lengthened partials. I get that they're in meta now and they're very trendy, but I have to be honest with you guys, I hate them. I hate them because they feel clunky, they add up to a set where I don't quite know exactly where I'm supposed to end my set. I personally like to have clean sets with clean reps, and that's it. My rep ranges are set in a way where length and partials change too many parameters, and I don't see the point because they make standardizing my work much more difficult. So I'm not gonna use them, even though the literature seems to point to them being more effective. And that's fine. See, you don't have to deny the evidence to stick to your ways. And no one will come to your door with a gun to force you to follow optimal training techniques, because at the end of the day, it's up to your own appreciation. And there's also no need to be optimal all the time. Because what really matters in bodybuilding is to do. So if whatever you're doing right now works, keep going. Keep an open mind, keep looking around for information that might be useful later on, that might change your mind and improve your training, but there is no reason to be stressed out about all of this, because if there's one thing that the just lift bro types have understood, it's is that, yeah, at the end of the day, just fucking lift. And this next message is one that I want to share with those of you guys who are struggling with that. The ones who are perfectly fine with evidence-based training, but who never actually apply. Keep in mind that theory is completely useless if you don't apply it. And at the end of the day, the most important study is the one you run on yourself. You are your own experiment. So before you get overwhelmed by all of these new findings and all of these fancy methods, make sure that you have the basics down. And actually, this is another thing that Nipot's paper shows beautifully. The fact that the basics of proper bodybuilding technique are fairly simple and are well established. You don't need to go into these super complicated routes. You have the core and the basis of the training, things that we all pretty much agree on, and then you have what gravitates around it. And what gravitates is often a matter of meta. So if you play video games, I don't have to explain that term to you, but if you don't, a meta is a specific environment in which certain characters or certain items are more powerful than others because their stats just happen to be higher. And this meta changes all the time. But the thing is that in a video game, these changes are usually brought up by the fact that there's a modification to the code. So the video game universe is modified to the core. It is the mechanisms themselves that are changed that make it so that suddenly you have to adapt to these new items and these new characters. But the good news is that there's no such thing in our world, right? The basic nature of biology and biomechanics hasn't changed for the past 10,000 years, and that's being extremely generous. So this means that the way we've been training for the past 100 years is pretty much that. It's 90% of what we know works. All of these studies that come out, all of this optimal training really concerns itself with the remaining 10%. What it does best is actually confirm that the 90% work. So it's telling us that what we've been doing is actually the right way to train. So please don't get swept up by the meta. Because at best, these new optimal techniques offer marginal improvement over what we already know works, the orthodox meta, but that's that. They don't really do more than that. And this is coming directly from the people who run the studies. I've spoken to Milo, and we actually had a debate recently, where he, one of the main people that worked on lengthened partials, said that they had some, but not that much, and that it was dangerous to hyper-focus on them at the detriment of the rest of your training, something that he started to see many people do, or they claim that lengthened partials would turn you into Ronnie Coleman. No, they don't have that power. They are the cherry on top. They are a technique that can be very useful for muscle growth if you add it on top of an already pre-planned and proper training method, but by themselves, they are simply not enough. And worse than that, as I said, they can even become detrimental if you let them interfere with your training, which is true for all of these intensity methods as well. Hard sets are always king. As long as you got your hard sets down, you're good. If you want to tack on additional things afterwards, that's okay, but always make sure that these things don't impede your ability to perform on the hard sets. And to go back to the example of video games, this is something you see a lot with MOBAs and with fighting games. So League of Legends and Smash Melee are a good example. You see people who hyperfixate on tier list and character variability, all of these small marginal details, instead of focusing on what matters, which is get better at the fucking game. Get better at the basic mechanics of moving your character around, of using your spells. That is what you should focus on, because this is what is going to allow you to become much, much better down the line, regardless of the technique that you use, the character that you pick, or the champion that you select. And I understand that this is hard because we all want the best, right? We all have this obsession with optimization, and we all suffer from the fear of missing out. You don't want to find out a year down the line that the training technique that you followed is actually subpar, because now you're going to think, oh shit, look at all of these gains I left on the table. I get it, I'm the exact same. But the point of this segment is to let you know that this is very unlikely to happen. As long as you follow these broad guidelines that the study actually perfectly detail at the end in the conclusion, you're going to be all good. And these guidelines, for the most part, are things that you already know. And you also must accept the fact that you will never be able to know the full outcome of your training. That's not possible. But if you obsess over it, you're going to start to think about the results of your actions before you even attempt the action, meaning that you're very likely to actually do nothing. And you'll be the type to just ponder away, hyperfixate, you'll get paralysis by analysis, and then you'll never get there, even if the method that you follow is optimal. So here's my advice to you. If you're stuck in that slump, simply pick a program, pick a technique, and go. It's the same with video games. Pick a character that you enjoy. Even if it's C tier, it does not matter. And yes, this also applies to lifts. I understand that it might sound hypocritical because I make tier lists, but in every tier list, I tell you guys that as long as the lift is between B tier and S tier, you're good. These are the things that we know work. After that, C tier, D tier, these might be detrimental. But hey, at the end of the day, it's your journey. So pick one thing, get good at it. Don't wonder or worry whether or not this is optimal. You have plenty of time to worry about that later because yes, this is also something that must be said. Most of you guys are beginners and optimization is not something you need to consider or think about right now. Because, and this is something that you need to hear, you can adjust things down the line. If you made a mistake or you did something that wasn't optimal, it can be modified. You're not stuck with them. And this is something that I'm going to leave you with. I hope that this video gave you that mix of scientific information and practical advice to make sure that you get the best type of data for your training, but also that you understand how to apply it properly and how to not let it stress you out. Because at the end of the day, all of this is supposed to be fun. Even research and information should be fun. If it becomes detrimental, what even is the point? If you enjoyed this video and you learned something from me, please consider supporting this page on Ko-fi. It is the first link in the description. A $3 a month pledge is already a lot, and it allows me to keep putting a lot of time in these videos. And I'm going to leave you with that. The next video is not going to take as long to come out, so I will be seeing you very soon. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.